Okay, time to get started. So today we're going to talk about exploring the Office developer story in Microsoft Office 365. Just to introduce myself, my name's Elaine Van Bergen. I'm a principal consultant down at OBS Melbourne. I also help run the local Melbourne SharePoint user group and involved in a lot of SharePoint Saturday events. So if you want to talk about any SharePoint community stuff, definitely come and have a chat to me. I do also have a blog, and I don't really blog very much, but I will put the code that I'm going to show here up on my blog sometime later. Best place to catch me though is usually on Twitter. So we're going to talk about a few different things. We're going to start nice and easy with some SharePoint Online branding and some methods for how you actually make SharePoint Online look really nice. Then we're going to jump into business process automation and talk around InfoPath and workflow. And we'll move on to Office client integration, so how you can actually do some code on-premise from within Office to connect up to various parts of SharePoint and Exchange Online. And in there we'll also throw in a demo of some Exchange code, and I'm going to talk about dashboards and data visualization at the end of the session. So the key takeaways that I'm hoping you'll get from this session is that there are many extensibility points within Office 365. A lot of people, bad-mouthing the cloud and the sandbox from a development point of view, but there is actually a lot of decent solutions that you can put together, especially when you look at some of the hybrid elements like the Office client development that I'll show you. Plenty of ways you can get data in and out of the cloud if you're a little bit clever with some of your architecture. However, it is a different platform. Most of us haven't worked with, a platform like this before, so don't think big to start with. Start with something small, nice, easy customization, and then as you get more confident with the platform, move forward and make things a little bit more complicated. Also, it is a very much evolving platform, so as we move forward and move into future versions of SharePoint, you'll see a lot more functionality coming into Office 365 and the stack in general. So we're going to start with a little bit of branding, because I don't know about you guys, but it's half the time I build this awesome solution. It does, 20 cool technical things. I show it to a business user, and the first thing they say is, but it doesn't have a logo, or it's the wrong blue, right? Business users really care how things look. So with Office 365, we've got a number of different branding options, from very simple stuff to logos and themes that you might do just through the browser. Or you might take it a little bit further and do a custom CSS, custom master page, page layouts or web parts, or even redo the whole user experience. There's some fantastic things you can do if you start looking at Silverlight and JavaScript. Even if it's just simple jQuery manipulation of the user interface, you can really get SharePoint Online to look anything that you'd like it to. However, there are a few caveats. Generally, it's pretty similar to branding a normal on-premise SharePoint site, with the main exception being a sandbox solution means you can't put any files in _layouts, which sometimes we will do with our branding solutions. So what's going to happen is every single site collection that you have loaded up on SharePoint Online will actually have to have a copy of its own master pages and its own page layouts and its own images and its own CSS. Now that can mean that if you end up with 10 or 20, however many different site collections, and you want to make a change, you're actually going to have to upload the feature to each of those 10 or 20 different site collections. Of course, you could look at doing something nice, and doing a sort of some code off-premise to do that approach. But just be aware that every site collection has its own copy. So if you are going to do really elaborate branding, you'll have to think about that upgrade process. Also, you can't have custom code behind your master pages. Generally, you shouldn't be needing to do that anyway. You can put your customizations in web parts and those kind of things where it belongs. Multiple ways of deploying your customization, just the same as normal SharePoint. You can manually edit in SharePoint Designer. And while we don't like to do that on premise very often, if you've got an Office 365 site collection, it's a single site collection, it's the only one you've got, perfectly valid approach to open up SharePoint Designer, make some changes to your branding and just have it saved up there. You don't necessarily need to go to that stage of packaging up those features. The only thing I will say is be very careful once users are on there. Very easy to break your entire site by breaking the master page or breaking a page layout, and everything will go down. So think about, even though you're doing manual changes, how are you going to stage them? Are you going to have a test site that you're going to make sure everything's okay on? The next approach is just packaging things up into features. So if you've got multiple site collections, this is a really good way to do it. Package things up into a feature and then you can push that up to SharePoint Online, hit the activate button and it will do the branding changes for you. Really nice and easy. If you've got a more complex bunch of customizations that you want to load up, or you want to create perhaps multiple sub-sites based off the same template, you can either look at doing site templates via the browser or look at going to web templates built by Visual Studio. And I'll show you a little bit of an example of a web template. So let's jump to the demo. All right, so this is a basic Office 365 site. SharePoint Online looks just like any normal SharePoint site. And over here you'll see we've got the normal options. So we could do, you know, we've got our master pages. We could go through and we could choose a different theme from any of the themes that are over there. So if we wanted to flick the site theme across, we can do that. Pick any one of the themes and it will theme up quite normally. The same, we can change title, description, or we could put an icon in here. But let's actually have a look at how we would load up our packaged solutions. So we're looking at Sandbox Solutions here. You know, obviously we're in Office 365. We don't have any PowerShell to deploy anything. What we actually do is we go to the Solution Gallery. When the Solution Gallery loads, if you click on the Solutions tab up here, now see we've got the option to upload a solution. And I'll pick one that I prepared earlier. I'm just going to upload a WSP. We upload it up and we now have a user interface where we can very easily activate the solution. And that goes off and does the activation. You'll see also that any solution that I create has a resource usage that it keeps track of. Each SharePoint Online site actually has a quota. So you do have to be very careful about your customizations, that you're not performing too much inefficient code. Otherwise you'll break your resource usage quota. You can see here I've got 100 per day. If this was doing lots and lots and lots of crazy code, that might cap out that quota and actually stop the customizations on this site. So in this case, uploading that solution did a number of little things. You can see very simply, it just flicked the logo, right? So I've just put a little bit of code in there. It's gone in, uploaded my image and automatically flicked the logo across for me. It's also gone and uploaded a web template. You see it's a little bit different in SharePoint Online when you create a new site, but here's my web template that it's pushed in, and now I can go off and create a test site on that. And this will create a much more complex site with a number of different customizations inbuilt with it. So we'll just let that process on through. The other thing to be aware of with Sandbox Solutions is that the upgrade process is completely different than it is for normal solutions that you might build. Normally, if you want to upgrade code, what you'll do is you actually go through and you'll change the versioning of your WSP within your features, and then you'll update it. So here's the site I've created. Very nice and easy. It's gone off, it's created a custom welcome page, it's put a custom field, a custom page layout, a custom default page, that kind of thing. So now anytime that I select that TechEd publishing template, it's got all my customizations all inbuilt. So if we have a look at what happens when you upgrade a solution, basically if you wanted to push an upgrade of this through, we'll just get it to select solutions. You actually need to rename WSP. Here I've got one with the same structure, but with 2 in it. When I load this up, because it's picking up that all the GUIDs are the same, you see instead of an activate button, it's given me an upgrade. So I can now hit the upgrade dialog, and that will actually push through my new solution. So the really nice thing about this is I actually now have a process that, hey, maybe something went wrong in that upgrade. You know, I don't actually like version 2. I can actually deactivate it and go back to version 1. It's a really nice feature where you can flick around different versions of your customizations just through the browser, and so the business user actually has that level of control. But this is a technical session, so let's jump into some code. So the first bit we saw was basically a nice little feature that just went through and flicked the custom logo. So that was done here in my Solution Explorer. Basically I've got a module here, MO Images, And you'll see in here, I'm just pushing a nice little element. I'll make it a little bit larger. I'm just pushing an image file into the style library. So I couldn't put it underscore layouts. It's a very common place to load it up. And it's just the same as if it was on premise. Just only loading it up, it's on the root web. And all I've done is very simply in here, I have a nice little bit of code that's literally just setting that site collection when the feature activates. So it's just setting that logo very nicely and easily. Now, one of the things you'll notice that when you start doing SharePoint Online code is there are some limitations. So normally what I would do on premise is I would save the existing site collection logo into my property bag, and then I'd retrieve that when I deactivated. Unfortunately, in SharePoint Online, you're actually blocked from accessing the property bag, so you can't do that bit of functionality in this case. So the rest of the structure here is related to actually the full web template. So you can see here I've got a number of different elements. I have my master pages, very simply just pushing that through into the master page catalogue and just setting the properties on that. I have my page layouts, same thing, a welcome page, a site column. But the core of it is actually this web template piece down here. If I actually look at how this is done, basically when I create a web template, out of the box it's just following behind the scenes it's actually just an out of the box type of site. So you can see here I've based it on the publishing site because I wanted publishing features enabled. And I've given it my own little display category just so it appeared under that tech ed heading that you saw. The main part of a web template is actually this ONET file here. And you'll see this is where I go through, and all I have to do, because I can't do feature stapling up in Office 365, is I go through and actually set up my configuration elements. So I'm telling it which site collection features to enable, and most of these are just out-of-the-box publishing ones that you can see, and which web level features to enable. And that's where I've got, so I've got my welcome page provisioning feature, which is one of the ones in here. So basically what happens is every time someone selects this template, it runs through this file and just enables every one of the features that I've put in here. So all my logic is literally just in these features you're seeing up here. What I've got is a site web publishing template. This is actually a site level feature, and this is actually pushing all those modules and things that you saw before. So my content types, my images, my master pages and my page layouts, all into that site collection level because that's where we want them to live. And then we have our web template deploy. Now normally on premise you might look at doing that at the farm level so that you could have site collections created off it, but because we're online we actually do this at the site level, so it's only really applying for sub-sites from this point, and that's just deploying that little web template we saw. And then we basically have our web level customizations, which are the content type bindings. We're setting a property bag field and just putting the welcome page. So you can actually do the property bag stuff through XML. That still works in SharePoint Online. It's just when you try to manipulate it through code that you actually can't do that. Now the reason I'm setting this is because then if I ever want to do anything off premise and do a call up, I might want to look at what's in the property bag to work out if I created this site or not. So I'm stamping it with my little metadata there so I know I created it. And the final bit is we do actually just have a ensure site feature. What this one does is I pass in a property to it and it will actually walk up from the subsite and it will make sure that any site collection features that I've passed in GUIDs of are actually enabled at that parent level, just to make sure that things like if I need publishing enabled, it turns it on for me so it doesn't throw an error. Those kind of things we do via code here. So basically you can see that we can go right from very, very easy branding, so whether that's doing things through just the user interface, setting things like setting things like the logo and the master and the theme, or you could open up SharePoint Designer just like we normally do on mucking around on dev sites, set the master page, set the CSS through there, or we can actually get quite technical and we can upload a whole site, a whole web level template that has all our customization in there. The really good thing is if you do go to the stage of building a web template, Although it might take you a little bit longer to build to start with, it's a very repeatable process. It's something you can test on-premise in your SharePoint development site, and then you can put into a test site collection up on SharePoint Online, and then push through to your production site collections on SharePoint Online. And you do have that versioning approach in there as well. So you can really have a very repeatable process, whereas if you go SharePoint Designer, you're always reliant on manual changes, and there's a lot more chance that things might go wrong along the way. Okay, so let's look a little bit about business process automation. So, you know, obviously there's no point in having this nice little SharePoint site that's sitting up there if you actually can't do any interactivity with it, you know. I mean, sure, you can get a lot of value by uploading documents, but most people want to have some kind of approval process on those documents. Or they might want to kick off a business process and have people enter information. So there's a number of different ways that we can actually start a business process in SharePoint Online. One of the most common ones is actually to use an InfoPath form. There's two flavours of InfoPath forms. We can do InfoPath forms in the browser, and we can do InfoPath forms that launch on the client. If we actually go and launch InfoPath forms on the client, that gives us some benefits when we do Office 365, because Office 365 is limited from doing web service calls, but if you actually pop the form up onto the client, you can do whatever web service calls and external connectivity you want. So it's a little bit of a way that you can break out of that sandbox if you actually need to. If you're doing a very simple item, maybe you just want to use a standard list to start off that workflow, or maybe it's as simple as kicking off a workflow when you add or you edit a document. Because we're in a SharePoint Online, we can actually only do declarative workflows. So we can't code up Windows Workflow code in Visual Studio and upload it into SharePoint Online. We can only do what we can do through SharePoint Designer. We can prototype that up in Visio. The only way we can actually extend it from Visual Studio is if you produce custom activities. So you can produce a custom activity, push that up, use it in SharePoint Online as part of your SharePoint Designer workflow, but you can't code up the entire workflow. We do have some improvements that have been added in 2010 that apply to both SharePoint Online and SharePoint On-Premise. So we've got the concept of a reusable workflow. This can be applied across many lists. So we don't have to, you know, if you want to have 3 document libraries that we're going to have the same workflow on it, that's when you want to use the reusable workflow so that you can apply it to those different document libraries. And we also have site-based workflows. These are really good for things that might go across multiple libraries as well. Maybe you want to look into 5 libraries and process different items. As well, we've got new workflow events. So we do actually have events that are fired within the workflow now that you can pick up on if you need to. One of the other improvements they added in SharePoint 2010 is the ability to prototype workflows in Visio. Now, as developers, we kind of don't really want to spend much time in Visio. The good thing is, though, Visio is a tool you can give to a BA. And if they actually use Visio and the template that I'm going to show you, it means that they can't create workflows that won't be possible in SharePoint Online. So a really good way to make sure they create a valid workflow and they give you that documentation, and then you can go through and push it up into SharePoint Designer. It's also a really good way to provide users with a visual of how the workflow is going and what the workflow process is, because we can actually take the Visio workflow and use that as a diagram as we push through. Okay, so once we create it in Visio, then we're going to have to actually export it to a VWI file. This is basically just a zip file that contains all the workflow information and Visio drawing. We then import that into SharePoint Designer, and we can load it up onto the site. So let's have a look at that. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at just an InfoPath form, and I'll show you how the form works first, and then we'll dive into some of the code. So basically, we're doing an InfoPath Online form. So you can see that it's just loading the form up in the browser here. And in this particular example, we're looking at timesheeting. So we want people, in this case, it might be contractors external to the organisation. We're going to get them to come into our Office 365 site, and they're going to enter in their timesheets. So here's my very basic form here. I've got a nice people pick that I can do a search in. Search for John Smith, load him up. date pickers, as can be expected. So let's make this one for tomorrow. Drop-down boxes, but with our boxes we can actually filter. So for so as we select things, if I pick customer 12, it's automatically populating some data into another box here. I can pick my activities, and the same as I filter through here, it's actually picking up the code for that item, and also sub-product families. We can also do things like conditional formatting. So for example, if I say I only worked, pretty lazy day, I only did 3 hours, it can visually highlight that's a bit of a problem, normally we'd expect to do 8 hours. But, I'm at TechEd, so of course I'm working 10 hours. Same thing, it can highlight that perhaps that's a little bit too long to be working. Down the bottom as well, you can see we're just pulling out all the different elements here that have already been submitted by this user. So I can actually see the past time sheets that I put in. And we'll submit that through. When I submit it, I'm actually using a combination of the user's login and the date to give it a unique name. So you'll see, because we're using SharePoint Online, which is claims-based authentication, the username's in a little bit of a different format that you can see there. But let's look at how the form was actually developed. So InfoPath, hands up if you've built an InfoPath form before. Oh, most of the audience, brilliant. So InfoPath form's really easy to build, very nice and easy. Basically, you just drag and drop on your controls. So if we were going to drag a text box on, you'll see that I can, put it in here and drag it around to wherever I need it to. And it's automatically created a field for me. Probably the one thing that I do like to see is that as fields are added, they need to be named appropriately, because when we push them up to SharePoint, or when you're going to try to use this XML that's produced from an InfoPath form in a business system, you don't want to have to think about field 1 and field 10 and what the actual data is in them. So make sure you get your naming of the field right. So very simply, we've got a bunch of SharePoint calls here. You can see that we're actually pulling out of various different lists. So if we look up at our timesheet, you can see these lists are all up here. So we've got our SAP codes, we've got our customer, we've got our products, and our cost centres. So a very nice and easy story if someone needs to edit some data, if you need to add another cost centre, if you need to add another SAP code, go into the list, add a new item, and the next time the form's run, that'll automatically appear into one of those drop-downs. As well, we've got our main submit connection. If we just go modify that, and you can see here, this is where I've done my function to get a unique name on it. So I'm just concatenating the username with the date, time, and loading up to that SharePoint site. And that'll make sure that it's always got a unique identifier in there for those files. Other things we've done as well, we've had that very basic rules. So if we look at our rules engine, that field that you saw changing colours, we had 2 rules on. So if not enough hours, so if it's below 6, we turn it red. Too many hours, we turn it yellow. If we want to add another one of those, very, very easy. We can also do validation the same way. Very nice validation engine, and if hours is equal to, not equal to, if it's blank, if it's not present, there's a whole bunch of different rules that we can add in, and very, very quite easy for a business user to go through and start defining up some of that logic. Being SharePoint Online, we actually can't put code behind it, but we can still do all these customizations here. Once we've designed up this form, very simple process of just publishing it up to SharePoint. So all we did was do publish, picked SharePoint server, just like we would if it was on-premise. And it actually goes through and it'll give us the ability to put in a URL. As you can see here, this is my site. I can then pick whether it's going to be in a form library or as a content type. We did form library in this case. We've already got our list there, but if we didn't, we could get it to create a new one for us. And then it will allow us to pick which fields we want to have promoted up to the library. So you can see here I've got quite a few selected. So up in my list over here, these are all the fields that you can see appearing here. They're the ones that we chose to push on up. Now, when you're doing workflow, it's particularly important to think about what are the fields that you're going to have to use in your workflow. Any ones that you want to have to pick up and pull out of that InfoPath form, you really want to try to publish up as list columns to make it easier to get at those items. And then if we just go through that wizard, hit finish, it'll just update our form, up it goes into SharePoint Online and users can load it as you saw. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a very simple workflow. So we'll start in Visio. We're going to play a bit of BA for a little while here. And the template we want to use is under Flowchart. It's called Microsoft SharePoint Workflow. If you don't see this here, you're running on the wrong version of Visio. You actually have to be on Visio Premium or above. If you're just on Professional, that one won't appear. So we create our workflow, and now we can see we've got a whole bunch of shapes down here. So most workflows have a start and a finish, of course. We drag those guys on. In this case, what I want to do is an action. Let's drag a couple of send emails on. And let's see, we've got a bunch of other actions, so we could delete the item, we can create list items, we can update list items. You can see we can even send documents to record centres, set various fields and times. In this case, we're just going to log to the history list. And then we're going to put a condition in. So we're going to put, if a particular field is in there, we're going to do something with it. And then we join these guys up. Now, the other thing that you'll notice is that there's a process tab up here in Visio. So the process tab actually has the validation. So, you know, this workflow that you can see here, it's not exactly valid. If I check the diagram, it's basically saying, well, I haven't actually labelled my connections with yes or no. So if I go through to here, we connect this guy back up. Just get rid of that. What I actually need to do is tell it which one of these is yes and which one of those is no to differentiate the two paths that I've added. Now if I check my diagram, it's a valid diagram. So it is actually checking that that workflow structure is sound. And you'll see that pretty much all these shapes here are things that you can actually do within SharePoint Designer. Now what it doesn't do is it doesn't make you specify any of the business rules or any of the connection rules that you need here. So really I've just said I'm going to log to a history list. I haven't said what I'm going to log to the history list or why. I've said I'm going to compare a field, but I didn't actually say which field, and I'm going to send an email, and I haven't had to specify what's in that email, who's it going to go to, or anything like that. So it is only a very large visual representation of the basic process. There's still a lot of additional information that you're going to need if you're actually building this. Now, of course, we can annotate some of this a bit further through text. So we might say, send approved email. And my spelling's always terrible, thanks to spell check. And in here, we might say, send rejected email to get a bit more of an idea what's going on. But in general, you'll need some kind of documentation, or ideally sit down with the BA that might have gathered these requirements while you're actually doing this in a SharePoint Online. So once we're happy with the workflow that we've built in here, then we go to the Process tab and we export it. And we will do demo. Export that one out, and then we go to my friend SharePoint Designer. So in SharePoint Designer, I open up the site, and then you'll see the Workflow tab there. Within Workflows, I have the ability to import from Visio, and I can now browse for that file that I exported. Pick it up, and that will actually import in. And it'll ask me what sort of workflow do I want to import it as. I mentioned before there was reusable workflows. So if you want to be able to run it on multiple items, you can pick as a reusable workflow and on what sort of items it will run on. In this case, we'll say all. Click the Finish button, and it's actually going to download the information on what workflow activities are available on the server for me. And then it will grab everything it can from that Visio file and create up the workflow within SharePoint Designer. Now once it finishes loading up in here, we'll then have to go through and add in all the extra information that I talked about before. So you can see that it picked up. Well, we want to log a message. What message? So it asked me now, what am I going to do? Workflow started. And obviously I can change to look up values or anything else that I can throughout the workflow. So I could look up things in the current item to add to here, or workflow variables, all kinds of things. We'll keep it nice and simple. Then we're going to say if a value, and ask me which value. Let's say the current item actually we'll do current item title. Whoops. Equals not empty. We're going to email list of users and we've got a lookup dialog. This is my email and I can go through and create some nice little options there. I can format it, do anything I need to make the business users happy with how it looks, and add again those lookups in there. So maybe I want to put some information from the current item. Save that off, and if I had a blank title, maybe I want to email the admin. Please fix this. All right, so now I've taken that Visio diagram and I've added all the necessary information to make it actually a real workflow that's going to be able to run. The other part of it is also, how do I want this to kick off? So that's under my workflow settings, and I can choose if I want to disable the manual start, or I can disable automatic starting on item creation or on item change. So maybe we don't want it to kick off when item changes. We can actually get quite advanced with reusable workflows as well, so you can pick up association columns and work out particular columns you need to be added to a list every time you attach this workflow. And we can even go within our workflow, we can even go in and start editing some of the forms. So the initiation form, that's the form that users see when the workflow kicks off. If we want to show a form with particular fields, all I have to do is go in here and add those fields. And then when you manually start the workflow, you'll get your form, you go in, you enter your fields, and away it goes. You can do the same with approval forms. You can ask, for approve, reject, and maybe more information and give them a box to push that in. But we're going to keep this quite simple. We'll publish it up. And then our workflow will be pushed up to SharePoint Online. And again, we've got the same check for errors there as well. We can also extend the workflow, even though it was created from that Visio diagram. There's nothing to stop us from putting additional conditions in here that weren't in that Visio. So maybe we want to, if it's modified by someone, or if a particular value equals something, we want to do a different action, or we want to do a different step. It's fairly advanced. What you will notice though is some of the items are a little bit more cut down in SharePoint Online than might be on SharePoint On-Premise. So just check some of the actions that you have available here and make sure the ones that you need are in that list. So now, you can see that we've got our TechEd demo workflow. And it asked me, where do I want to log it to? Which history list do I want to use? And do I want to let people manually start it? Yeah, we're going to start when a new item is created as well. So I'll push that through. My workflow's added. Now this time, when we do a timesheet, once we submit it in, we should actually kick off that workflow. Pick our user. And and just go through and quickly fill in our information again. Centre. And 8 hours is fine, send that through. Now our workflow should automatically kick off. So it's already run through, you can see it completed very quickly. So there's our history item, we asked it to log that, workflow started. And if we're lucky, there's our test email. So, you know, within, 10 minutes there, we've basically put together a nice little business process workflow, added it onto a list, pushed it up to SharePoint Online, emailed a bunch of users, and away we went. Okay, so we'll flick back to our slides. Now, obviously, the demonstration that we did then was a pretty basic one. You know, we're limited to what we can create in one of these nice little quick sessions. But there's a lot of business processes you could use this for, and particularly with Office 365 and SharePoint Online, that's a really nice, easy way to put things up for external contractors, people outside the organisation, to connect on in. With, you know, you can hook it up with their Hotmail accounts, all kinds of things like that, where they kicked on in, kick off a workflow, whether it's through a list item or filling in a form, and then you could actually have that information pushed through to your on-premise business systems. And I'll show you some ways that you might want to do that in a minute. One of the other parts of Office 365 is the Exchange piece. So really nice, easy. You've got your Web Outlook, which you saw there, where we've got calendars and we've got mail items. Now, I don't know about you guys, but if anyone did Exchange development, 5 years ago or so, it was terrible. It was really, really hard. You waded through lots of documentation, very difficult. And, I was a little bit worried when I started looking at, geez, how are we going to do that kind of stuff with Office 365? And then I had a look at this Exchange Web Service Managed API 1.1. It's amazingly easy to use. In fact, it's easier to code against than SharePoint Online. It's a really great managed API, and it has pretty much functional parity with all the web services that used to be there. It takes care of everything for you. It's completely compatible with being on-premise and within the cloud, so you don't actually even need to know whether it's an on-premise Exchange installation or whether it's on Office 365. It's got versioning in there as well, so you can actually run different code based on different versions of Exchange. With it, it's got an auto-discover URL feature. So sometimes you might have a hybrid environment where some of your users are using Office 365 for email, and some of them are actually using an Exchange on-premise installation. Other times that'll be, just geographic location. So if you're in Melbourne, you might be using one Exchange server. If you're in India, you might be using a different Exchange server. The Auto-Discover API means you can just plug in a user and it will actually work out where the mailbox is. Just goes and does it. How that works is you basically call the client contacts Auto-Discover service. It'll do a validate URL via a callback. So it'll basically sit there, you'll get your callback. The callback will then come and it'll say, this is the URL for the Exchange web service for that particular user. And then it will push it up and give you the ability to do whatever you need to do via the Exchange web services. You can also do impersonations. So typically, you want to do things on behalf of a whole bunch of users rather than just for the user that's running an application. So in this case, you actually do need to have the application impersonation role granted to the user that you want to have run the code. Typically, that's a service account, and then you can jump into other people's mailboxes and put calendar appointments in there, pull down their calendar appointments, or check their mail items, those kind of things. Incredibly easy to do, and I'll show you the code and a demo for that in a minute. The other way we can connect through to Office 365 is also with Office Client integration. So with SharePoint 2010, they released the .NET Managed Client Object Model. This is basically a cut-down version of the SharePoint APIs that you can run from a normal sort of .NET application. So whether it's .NET 4, 3.5, doesn't matter. There are some naming changes once you get down into the .NET Client Object Model. So you'll notice in normal SharePoint development, we would use the SP context item. In the .NET managed, the SharePoint client object model, that's client context. SP site becomes site, SP web becomes web, list, you know, that kind of thing. Below that top level, most of the functions are actually called the same thing. So, you know, spweb.quick-launch enabled is web.quick-launch enabled. So it's not too hard to get used to. The other thing you will notice though is it's a cut-down API. So as you go through, you'll look at the site object. Not all the things that you're used to seeing on the site object will be available. But that's fully trimmed in Visual Studio, so you can't actually just add things that aren't supported. Also, the way that you do .NET Managed code is very similar to Silverlight and JavaScript, the JavaScript versions of the client object model. So you can also do those customizations I was talking about, where you might want to change the whole user interface of SharePoint, but pick up the code from SharePoint, whether it's list items, those kind of things, through a managed, through a typed object model. So you can actually pull list items out, all those kind of things, without having to do web service calls. And in fact, when you're coding from a remote server onto SharePoint, using the .NET Managed client object model is now the preferred way to do it. You shouldn't be calling the web services unless you're on a platform that can't use one of these three client object models. When you use the managed controls and logic, it goes through the managed OM, actually goes up to a proxy and will do an XML request to the client service on the server. It will do what it needs to do at SharePoint's end, push everything back as a JSON response down to your managed code. So that's architecturally how it works. Fortunately, all that stuff is hidden from you. You just need to know how to write the managed object model code, and it will take care of everything for you. The one tricky bit with SharePoint Online is authentication. So SharePoint Online actually uses claims-based authentication with multiple authentication providers. And sorry, the links are a little bit hard to read with the formatting there. It's really complicated. I'll show you through some of the authentication code and how it works to give you an idea of what it does. Don't try to write that stuff yourself. It's crazy. These two links are some really good samples to do what we call, to do the two different sorts of authentication that you might want to do. The first link gives you an example that will pop an authentication form from the client and they can fill in their username and password. The second one is for what we call headless authentication, so where you're going to give it a username and password and connect on through. Grab those samples down, modify them if you need to, you get the full code for them, and then use that for your authentication. So let's have a look at this. Okay, let's just make sure we're on the right day. Yep. So we're just showing we've got no calendar appointments yet. And we'll just kick this off and we'll actually show you it running, and then we can walk through some of the code and show how it works. So what I wanted to do is basically we have our timesheet billing example, right? So we've got all these contractors, they're going online, they're busily entering their timesheets into a nice little SharePoint Online site. What we actually want to do as a next step though is we'd actually like to then submit invoices for that time. So we want to create a Word document invoice and send that out. And basically how we've decided to do that is through a nice little Office add-in. So I've added this Office 365 actions item to my ribbon, and on load it's gone up and it's pulled down a bunch of timesheets for me. So I can pick my timesheet, hit load, that's done another call up to Office 365 and populated out this information. So this was actually, I think, the first one I entered earlier. And I pulled it down into all my custom fields. You know, obviously we're sticking with the purple theme being at TechEd. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click my process button. On process, I'm performing a couple of actions here. So what I'm actually doing is I'm grabbing all this invoice information. I'm doing another call up to SharePoint Online to say, yep, I've processed that item. So let's update a field on the list and mark it as being processed. And then I'm actually calling out and also doing that exchange piece that I mentioned. So I'm passing through some information to which user to pick, and then it will go up and it should actually do a calendar appointment. it's got there yet. It's nearly done. It's running a little bit slowly. There we go, it's done. So once it's done, it's cleared that, and then it's refreshed the list as well, just to get rid of the one that I'd already processed. So if we look, just to prove that things worked, there's my calendar appointment that's pushed up into my mailbox. Basically just set some customer information on it and put a calendar item in there. And also up in timesheets, the one that I processed is now set to invoice sent yes, whereas the default was no. So you can still see I've got those items as no. So let's have a look at some of the code for all of that. We'll just stop it from running. So the first thing that we saw was a ribbon. So we did a ribbon customization. This is the same for any VSTO sort of add-in, how you would do that. Basically, you can just add your visual ribbon in this case, and then we have a toolbox of items that we can drag on and you know, add to my ribbon there. And I've put some code behind each of these buttons, which we'll have a look at. So if we've got our load event. So when this ribbon loads, we're going to do load items. In load items, we're going to do our authentication. So we go in here, and basically I'm putting in some particular details here, and then we grab our client context object, which is what we need from the managed client object model to be able to do any activities, and then we give it an executing web request callback. So basically, as soon as it kicks off a web request, it's actually going to kick this event in, which is my authentication code. Now this comes out of a whole bunch of crazy stuff that's been written in here that goes off and deals with the STS. So basically what we have to do is when we're doing headless authentication in this, it's got to go off, go to the SharePoint, go to the token services that are being used for the SharePoint Online client object, the SharePoint Online site, give it that username and password, do the authentication, and there's a whole bunch of code in here that will then grab the cookies that are returned and massage them and then give it back in a format so that we can use those cookies on future requests. So definitely, we won't run through how all this authentication code works, but definitely have a look at the sample. This is the one from Chris Johnson's blog. Has a whole bunch of WCF in there as well to get that running. So there's a lot of code behind the auth piece, but the good thing is all you basically need to do, call it, username, password, URL, hook up the event handler, and it'll do everything you need. What we're then doing is we're just checking to make sure, you know, a bit of defensive programming there. If we have successfully got our context, then we are actually going to get a list, and in this case I'm passing in the title of the list because I know timesheets is a list I want. I'm doing a camel query, so where the invoice sent field is no, give me back everything ordered by title, and then I'm going to call get items. Now with the client object model, you won't actually get anything returned to you until you load the items that you want and you call the execute query method. So if, for example, I tried to access something, if I'd gone tslist.title here and tried to turn a property of it, because I hadn't done a load event and loaded my list, that would actually throw an error. The reason it does that is to try to be very efficient. So you'll notice that the only thing that I've loaded in this particular instance is the items. So it's going to do all this piece of getting the list by the title, throwing that query in and working out what items to return at the server end. Then it's going to push down the wire to me just the list of items that I asked for. Very important, you know. We could have put all these load methods in anywhere we liked, but that will become very inefficient if I'm calling backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. This way, everything happens on the server in one call, I get my item back and I process them through. Just doing some basic code in here just to go through and populate that drop-down list. Now let's look at the next one. So we had our load button. So very similar stuff. I'm just getting the selected item here, so the ID of the item. I'm connecting back up to my client context with my authentication again. Very similar. This time I'm getting the item with the ID that's selected, so I know which one to get. This time get by ID instead of get by title or get by query. Loaded that item up and executed my query. Now that I've loaded, in this case, all it passed down the wire was that one single item. Again, very efficient, nice and easy. Executed my query, and then I'm going off and popping the information into a bunch of my fields in here. So if we actually look at what I did in this case, I've just got a Word document. Oops. And within my Word document, these are my properties. They're basically just sitting there. They're set to be public properties. You can see, whoops, I haven't quite got that one selected. Each one of these has a unique name, and that's all I'm doing in my code, is setting each one of those to the value returned from the SharePoint list for that item. Popped each of them in there, and then I'm locking each of them to make sure they can't be updated afterwards. So I just unlock it before I unlock every field before I update it, and then lock it after I'm done. Next bit of code. So the final bit of code there is generate. So when I hit generate, what it did, again, is grab the selected item, so make sure it gets the item ID, create my calendar appointment. Here's all the code I needed to create my calendar appointment. Very simple, not a lot of code there at all. And notice the credentials. I just passed in a network credential, and for my auto discover, all I did is pass in a username and the URL and the callback to give me. So I didn't have to worry with Exchange Online whether it was claims-based auth or any of that kind of stuff. It just worked it out for me. I didn't have to worry where that service was living. It didn't matter. If this was my work, Exchange account, which was on-premise, this code would work perfectly fine for both. Set up an appointment object, set the subject, the body, the start and the end. In this case, I set it to end 1 hour after the code ran, and just hit save. Calendar appointment done. Nice and quick and easy. Then straight after that, a little bit more SharePoint Online code. We're just connecting again to the client context, making sure our authentication's there. We load our item again, and in this case, after I've loaded it, I then set that invoice field to true, do an update, and execute that update. Then go back and reload my items. So not really a lot of code to do some quite nice functionality there connecting up from the Office client. So as you can see, the Exchange code was really easy there, really nice to use, very, very easy to use. The SharePoint Client Object Model also has some great functionality. We can pull down list items, we can update list items, we can create items. If you combine a couple of those with your on-premise sort of Office customizations, whether that's from a full application you've built, whether it's within Word or within Outlook or any of those kind of items, there's a lot you can do to create a really nice end-to-end business process, connecting up from on-premise data and connecting with Exchange and SharePoint Online data. The only complicated piece is that authentication part with SharePoint Online. And for that, there's some great code samples up on MSDN and a few blogs which are in this deck to get you started. Okay, so the last bit we're going to talk about is a little bit about dashboards and data visualization. So once we get a business process up online, people like to see a bit of information about how it's running, how it's tracking and what's going on. Typically, most businesses have Excel information that's trapped in workbooks that gets emailed around to everybody. SharePoint now has the ability to use Excel services to push this information up online into a more managed way. And essentially you can expose an Excel application onto the web, have that single source of truth for that Excel report without having to go through the need of making someone code it up and push it into reporting services or another reporting platform. So basically, Excel services is a calculation engine. It gives us a nice little web client for showing people Excel workbooks. They don't need to have Excel loaded, so really good for SharePoint Online where users might not have Excel. They could be in an internet cafe somewhere. And it also does expose its information out using web services, REST and JavaScript, so you can use it in other business solutions. The other piece that we have is the chart web part. This is a really flexible, nice, easy wizard-based approach for going through and creating charts based on data, whether it's in a SharePoint list, from another web part, or even in one of those Excel workbooks that you've loaded up. Nice and easy to customise, and you can actually pick from one of quite a lot of chart types. We'll have a look at that. Once we push some of this Excel content out, you can actually pull down the information from there as well. So through the REST services, for example, we can embed the chart into another web page. Or we can use the JavaScript client object model to start putting that into some of our sandbox solution code and putting some really nice visualizations on top of it. And basically we can do all that without having to write server-side code. If you have a look at the web services, so if you're calling from on-premise, you might use a web service. You can call the Excel service.asmx, add the service reference, and then you've got the full SOAP API there. You can basically program, get the workbook, get ranges out of the workbook that are stored up in SharePoint, get charts, all those kind of things that you need to do. You've also got the REST API, so this is really good if you just want to jump on and grab via URL, something like in this case, we're actually grabbing out a particular chart from within that Excel workbook. Grab that down and you could load that on another system anywhere, you know, anywhere that can just pull this URL out. So we'll jump back into our demo. Okay, so we're back on our timesheet site. We're going to start by creating what's called a status list. We'll create this called indicator. This gives us the ability to create basically traffic lights. You know, what manager doesn't like a nice little traffic light indicator? If we go in here, we can now create a new indicator. We'll say timesheets submitted. We're going to do it from a SharePoint list in this instance. So we want it to pick up from our timesheets list. And it's going to grab that reference down. That's a strange one. And in this case, we have a view already set up that just filters in current timesheets. And so if we now pick, we're going to say we want to know the number of items in that particular view, which is already filtered down to only show items for the last month. If that is lower, if it's lower than, actually we'll do higher. If it's higher than 10, something we're doing a good job. 10 people have submitted their timesheet for that month. If it's only 5, we're a little bit worried and we want to display the yellow indicator. And there's, you know, we can specify when it's going to update, all kinds of things on the detailed link. So we can link it through to another page for more information. And we can push through as many of these as we like. So we might also want to do timesheet processed. And again, pick our same list. We'll do current timesheets. If there's too many that have particular custom number, we could do a percentage of a particular customer number, any of the fields really that are available in the list we can pick up, whether it's equal to, greater than, contains, and do percentages on those and actually have the indicator change as well. Once we've got our indicators up, then we need to put them somewhere. So if we go up to our front SharePoint list, we can then go in here, insert, go to more web parts, business data, and we've got two different choices. So we can pick our status list or we can pick an individual indicator. So in this case, if we have more than one indicator, we might do status list. That'll push on down and then we can edit the web part. Pick where our indicator list lives. And then choose which indicators to show and how to show them. So do we want to only show the statuses, only show ones that are in the problem area? or only show particular columns. In this case, we'll leave it as the default. And then we get our nice little indicators there on the front page. Very nice and quick and easy to see. Or we could go through and, you know, maybe they want it to be check marks. Set that off. So that's our sort of first level of basic information onto our little indicator there. You know, as we go up to 10 items, this will then change to the green indicator. If it's below 5, it would go to red. The other one that we're just going to quickly run through is that chart web part, business data, chart web part. We'll add that on through. And we've just got our nice little wizard approach. So we go through data and appearance. And it will ask, basically, where do I want to connect it to? Well, I'm going to connect it to a SharePoint list. And I want to connect it to my timesheet list. And it gives me just a view of that data, because I could choose to filter it at this point. So I want to filter it with specific parameters. So, you know, if I only wanted invoice sent due to a particular field, I could do that at this point, but we'll just leave it all in there. And then what do I want on which axis? So maybe I want to do hours, customer number, grouped by date. I can pick all kinds of other fields, so what's in the tooltips, what's in the data, what sort of data analysis do I want to do, and all kinds of advanced properties, but we'll keep it basic. I've got my nice little graph now showing different numbers of hours grouped by different dates, but, oops, sorry, I didn't want to go to advanced. Maybe I actually want to change how that looks. So these are all the different options I've got. You can see there's an endless number of crazy charts, you know. Maybe I want a funnel chart of all this, if that even makes any sense. I can even go through and define my custom ones. There you go, a nice graph that makes 0 sense. But the options are almost endless for what you can design up and provide with data visualization on top. So what you've seen is there's multiple ways to provide some visualization there on top of your business process or on top of your data that's stored within Excel. So whether that's, you know, pushing up an Excel workbook and showing a bunch of reports to people, or processing that out so that you can use it. So you might want to, one application that I've built basically used Excel as a calculation model. So we didn't have to design all the code behind, because all the calculations were developed by business users in Excel, and they actually couldn't articulate some of those requirements. It's much easier just to plug numbers into their Excel workbook and calculate that from our web services. Or you can put Silverlight and JavaScript on top, so you can integrate with data from on-premise or other locations, even Windows Azure. So in this session, hopefully, I've shown you through a whole bunch of different ways that you can actually provide customization points within SharePoint Online. Whether that's simple things from branding, you know, putting up your own custom master pages, putting up page layouts, or if you've got a whole bunch of complex customizations you want to do in a web template, push that up and publish it up, and then move into more complex customizations. So maybe you want to go into the Exchange Managed API, or use the client object model and connect things up from your Office client solutions, or your other SharePoint, or your other, .NET client applications. In most cases, many of the solutions will leverage multiple parts of Office 365. So I think that combination of SharePoint Online and Exchange Online is a really powerful one when we're talking about these business processes. You know, you add that in with those InfoPath forms and those workflow processes that you saw, and you can really start to get a nice, pretty powerful business process running with Office 365. And so a large number of those solutions will involve many of those hybrid elements. I've got some very, very hard to see hyperlinks in there that you'll be able to grab out of the tool deck, out of the slide deck. The first one is the Office 365 Developer Toolkit. Really fantastic resource. It goes through and gives you a number of samples and labs that walk you through doing a lot of this stuff. So it'll go through how to do a whole bunch of branding. It'll go through and show you how to use the Exchange APIs, how to use the client object model, those kind of things. Before you do that though, you want to make sure that you've got the second thing, the Visual Studio Power Tools, loaded onto your copy of Visual Studio, because that gives you the ability to do sandbox web parts and various other features that you'll need as part of that. And of course, you might want to have to actually sign up to Office 365 as well to make sure you've got somewhere to test it. So the good thing is you can get a 30-day trial without having to pay any money. So you can actually sign up on a trial tenant, have a go with some of these customisations, see if they suit your organisation, and then make the decision to purchase later down the track. So with that, any questions? No questions. Yeah, so the question was, can we do the indicators, the charts on premise, or is it only 365? No, definitely, all that works on premise. In fact, on premise you have some additional connectivity, things you can do, like connecting through to analysis services, which you can't do in 365. Yep. Any other questions?
Those, on the word automation stuff and the workflow behind that, can you do that with the web apps?
So adding a custom toolbar and all that kind of thing?
And also then the workflow behind it?
Workflow, so the question was, can you do any of the things we saw with Word with the web app version of Word? So basically what we could do is you could certainly kick off a workflow via a document that was submitted online with the Office web app. It will kick off the workflow okay, but you can't program against it. So the bits you saw, like the custom toolbar I added, none of that would render in Office web apps. So sort of half of it you can do, I guess. Yeah, another question?
Is Office 365, can you set that up as like a private cloud within your own organisation, or is it only available via Microsoft?
So in Australia it's hosted at Telstra. So you can federate with your own Active Directory. So essentially you do have your own sort of little slice there. But it is actually hosted in a data centre, run via Telstra, or there's a number of partners that will actually set up that whole tenant organisation structure for you if you don't want to have to deal with Telstra. But all the functionality you saw there, you could do with SharePoint on-premise. So you could just install SharePoint yourself and you'd be able to do basically everything you saw there as well. Yep, one right at the back. Well, Microsoft hosts it, they've got to buy it through you guys. Yep. Yeah, so just to clarify, Microsoft hosts it in 2 data centres in a couple of different Asian countries. They've got full redundancy between their data centres. When you purchase it and everything else, you go through Telstra or another organisation that'll set that up for you if you want additional services.
Office 365 has a public site.
Yep.
Can you deploy sandbox web parts and use it?
Ooh, good question. So the question was, can you deploy some of the things that we saw, like sandbox web parts, onto the public website bit? No, you're limited to those. There's like a gadget sort of gallery that you can pull stuff down from. So you sort of can, but you'd have to go through that gadget marketplace sort of approval process to get your own stuff up there. So really, when you're thinking about that public website piece, you're best to think of it as a very simple public website that can only do the basic things which are available there. You're not going to build a fully customised SharePoint public website on it. Cool. One more.
Is there anything like a gadget toolkit?
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah. All right, so don't forget to put in your evaluation, and thanks for your time, everyone.